Good evening and welcome again. In this video, I'll be talking about housing issue in Canada. I'll look at the causes and also look at the effects and some intervention strategies in place. So, one of the causes is supply shortage. And what this means is that there's demand for housing and that has outpaced supply, especially in urban areas. There's also zoning laws and lengthy approval processes which restricts new housing developments. Another cause is population growth, and this has to do with high immigration and internal migration to major cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, etc., and this has increased demand for housing. Another cause is speculation and investment. For example, real estate has become a popular investment tool, leading to inflated prices. And also we see foreign investments and short-term renters like Airbnb reduce available housing stock. Another cause is income inequality, and this has to do with wages that have not been kept at the same pace with housing costs, especially for low and middle income earners. And last but not least, we have construction cost as one of the causes, and that has to do with rising cost of materials and labor, making building affordable housing more expensive. So how do we possibly tackle this issue? And when we have housing crisis, there is an effect. So what are some of the effects? So housing affordability crisis is one of the effects. Many Canadians spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and home ownership becomes unreachable for many, especially young people. So we usually experience homelessness, lack of affordable housing rather, which contributes to a rise in homelessness. There's also urban sprawl. People are forced to live further from the city centers, leading to long commutes and environmental strain. And there is also the social disparities, which involves growing gaps between homeowners and renters. And there's also marginalized groups, example, indigenous communities, are disproportionately affected. So interventions that has been looked at includes government initiatives. One of them is the National Housing Strategy, and NHS. It's a 10-year, 82 plus billion plan to build and repair affordable housing, and funding for non-profits and corporates to increase affordable housing options. Another strategy is zoning reforms. Some cities are revising zoning laws to allow for higher density housing, example, duplexes and triplexes. There's also vacancy taxes. What this means is that taxes on empty homes to discourage speculation and keep properties in the rental markets. And we also have the rent control policies, and these are regulations that are made to limit rent increases and protect tenants. And last but not least, there is initiatives for builders, and this is a tax. These are tax breaks and subsidies for developers who include affordable housing in their project. So this is a very real crisis. Housing crisis is a real crisis in Canada now, and things have just gone up, and mortgages prices have increased, rents have increased. So if you're experiencing anything like this, you could look at some of the strategies, interventions in place, and use those to combat the crisis in housing that you may be faced with. Thank you so much, and I hope this has been helpful. Have a good evening. Hi, and welcome again. This is Valerie. In today's video, I'm going to talk about immigration detention in Canada. I will look at the causes, and I will look at the effects and some strategies that is in place. So when we look at immigration detention in Canada, some of the causes includes legal and security screening. What does that mean? Detention is used to verify a person's identity, conduct background checks, or assesses security risk. So another cause for this detention is flight risk. So individuals may be detained if the government believes they might not appear for immigration proceedings. Another cause for immigration detention is the lack of proper documentation. People without valid travel or identity documents may be held until their status is verified. And as well, we have mandatory detention policies, and this is in place because in certain cases, for example, irregular border crossings, detention is automatically applied. So how does immigration detention affect us? What are some of the effects? So there's human rights concerns. Critics argue that detention conditions can violate human rights, especially for vulnerable groups like children and asylum seekers. Another effect is psychological impact. Detainees often suffer from stress, anxiety, and trauma, especially when held for long periods of time. There's another effect which has to do with the impact on families. Families can be separated and children may end up in foster care or be detained with their parents. And last but not least is usually the cost to taxpayers. So detaining individuals is expensive compared to community-based alternatives. So let's look at some of the interventions in place. So there's alternatives to detention programs, and it is called ATD, Alternatives to Detention Program. What this is community supervision, regular check-ins, and electronic monitoring as alternatives to holding individuals in custody. Another one is advocacy and legal reforms, and this has to do with human rights groups and lawyers who push for more transparent, humane, and equitable detention policies. Thirdly is called improved oversight, and this has to do with calls for independent oversight of detention facilities, especially those operated by provincial jails. And last but not least is detention limits. So this looks at proposals to impose maximum detention durations to prevent indefinite holds. So I hope that this has been helpful, and if there are issues with what I have just talked about, immigration detention, I hope that this makes some sense now, and I hope that it helps you shed light on the topic. Thank you for stopping by, and have yourself a good evening. Bye for now. Hello again, and welcome. In this video, I'll be talking about a very sensitive topic which most people do not like to hear, and it's regarding racial discrimination. In this topic, I will look at causes, effects, and interventions in place. So, racial discrimination, and it has to do with inequality, power and control, and so many other things. But let's look at the causes. To start with, there's historical injustices, and those injustices has to do with colonialism, slavery, segregation, and systemic oppression, which have shaped enduring racial biases. There's also stereotyping and prejudice, and this has been the case, especially when it has to do with media, education, and societal narratives often reinforce harmful stereotypes about racial groups. Another cause is institutional racism, and this is discriminatory practices embedded in institutions like law enforcement, healthcare, and education. And last but not least is the lack of awareness and education. So limited understanding of different cultures and histories contributes to unconscious bias. So how does this affect others? So it can affect minorities in various forms, and these forms include, one of them is economic disparities. Racial minorities often face barriers in employment, wages, and career advancement. Another effect is unequal access to services. Discrimination affects access to healthcare, education, housing, and justice. And there's also another effect which links with mental and physical health. And so these are experiences of racism which can lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and other health issues. And last but not least is social division. So discrimination fuels mistrust, tension, and inequality within communities and between groups. So how can we address this issue? A lot has been done, but a lot needs to be done when it comes to this topic. So some of the interventions include anti-racism education, and this is about teaching inclusive history and cultural awareness in schools and workplaces. There are also policy and legal reforms, which has to do with enforcing anti-discrimination laws and implementing equity policies in hiring, policing, and other sectors. We also have another intervention which has to do with representation and inclusion, and this talks about promoting diversity in leadership, media, and public institutions. There's also another intervention which is community programs and dialogue, and these are grassroots initiatives that foster dialogue, support marginalized groups, and build intercultural understanding. So I hope that this topic has shed some light on the issue of racial discrimination. Thank you much for listening, and have yourself a good evening or day or night wherever you find yourself. Bye for now. Hello once more. This is Valerie again with another social issue, and this has to do with criminal justice system inequality. So looking at this topic, I will address the cause, the effect and intervention that has been looked at. So, one of the causes of criminal justice system inequality has to do with systemic racism and bias, and racial and ethnic minorities often face discriminatory treatment in policing, sentencing, and incarceration. And another cause is economic inequality, which has to do with poor individuals that may lack access to quality legal representation and resources to navigate the system. There's another cause, which is over policing of marginalized communities, and that means that certain neighborhoods, often um, home to racial minorities or low-income groups, are subject to more frequent surveillance and arrest. Another cause is judicial discrimination and sentencing policies. So this looks at inconsistent sentencing practices, which can lead to harsher penalties for similar offenses based on race or socioeconomic status. How does this affect people? So some of the effects has to do with mass incarceration, and this looks at disproportionate imprisonment of marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous populations, in countries like Canada and the US. There's another effect which looks at erosion of public trust. A sense of injustice and bias reduces community trust in law enforcement and the justice system. And another effect is the cycle of poverty and crime. So incarceration can lead to job loss, social stigma, and reduced future opportunities, increasing the likelihood of reoffending. So last but not least is intergenerational impacts. So these affect families and communities, and these families and communities are destabilized with long-term impacts on children's well-being and development. So what has been done to address the issue of criminal justice inequality? Let's look at some of the interventions. So there's been criminal justice reform, and what this is that it's the revision of sentencing laws, for example, mandatory minimums, bail reform, and promoting um, restorative justice approaches. Another intervention that was being used or that is being used is bias and anti-racism training. These are training for police, judges, and legal professionals to reduce implicit bias and promote fair treatment. Another intervention that is being used is legal aid and support services, and that is to ensure equal access to defense and legal advice for low-income and marginalized individuals. And lastly, the other strategy that is being used is community policing and diversion programs. And this looks at building relationships between police and communities and offering alternatives to incarceration for non-violent offenses. I hope that this has been helpful and that it has shed some light or spark, your interest in some of the issues with respect to cause, effect, and intervention. Thank you again for stopping by. You have yourself a beautiful evening, day, or night, wherever you find yourself. Have a good day.